Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. In today's Israel Keys video, I'll be covering the timeline of events for the Courier trip. I hope you enjoy. It was in May of 2011 when Israel finally managed to finish building his silencer. Past plans had failed, but now he had finally managed to build a silencer which worked perfectly. He was proud of the silencer. He had the right ammunition, subsonic rounds, and was eager to test it out in Alaska. Shooting it in his shed wasn't going to cut it, and neither was shooting makeshift targets out in the woods. Israel wanted a human target, preferably more than one person. Israel got his wish in mid-May when he was scoping out parking lots in Anchorage. His girlfriend was out of town and his daughter was staying with an aunt. Israel was alone and free to explore Anchorage, seeking out his horrific fix. Having planned on shooting a young couple in their car late at night, an APD officer showed up and abruptly put an end to the couple's evening. Israel wasn't deterred by the cop though, his white supremacist roots itching for him to pull the trigger, as his childhood buddies Chevy and Shane Kehoe had done years earlier in a police shootout in the 90s. Unlike in their situation, Israel had the upper hand. He paused for a moment and continued observing, fantasising about how the situation would unfold if he were indeed to pull the trigger. 1 minute the cop would be in the frame, the next he'd be on the ground. Israel would continue watching, amused by the startled young couple's reactions, wondering what had just taken place. They'd be next. Unexpectedly, Israel's plans would be foiled as another APD officer pulled up to the parking lot. Israel weighed up his chances and decided not to push his luck. He knew that he'd be travelling back east soon. For now, he needed to get back in control of himself. His insatiable urge to kill almost causing a bloodbath in the parking lot. On June 2nd of 2011, Israel packed his bags and left for his flight to Chicago. In his luggage he had his Ruger Charger and silencer, which he'd broken down for obvious reasons. Israel had labelled the parts so that he'd be able to quickly rebuild it for use down in the lower 48. The silencer sat in a bag, camouflaged amongst plumbing parts. Israel's trips tended to have him mentioning a reason as to why he was visiting. The alibi that Israel gave for this trip was to plant trees at his Constable property in New York. He told this to his ex Tammy, who his daughter was staying with whilst he was away, and his mother Heidi. He was also going up to Maine to do some work on his family property and spend some time with his brothers. As the plane left Ted Stevens International Airport, Israel knew that he'd claim another victim soon. Someone in Maine more than likely, but as he was fully aware, none of his plans were ever concrete, and being able to adapt to situations was the key. Israel arrived in Chicago, rented a car from Hertz and drove to Indiana. Israel met his mother and sisters in Indiana and was in the state from June 3rd to June 5th. Prior to leaving his mother's house, he had informed her of his plans at his New York property. Heidi would purchase Israel some camping supplies, as he hadn't brought any with him. He said his goodbyes for the time being, knowing that he'd be seeing his family on his way back to Chicago. It was on June 3rd that Lauren Spira vanished from Bloomington, Indiana, Israel's rental car having made toll payments further north. There's no evidence tying Israel to Lauren Spira, but he was asked by the FBI if he was involved. He responded by laughing. That's how hard it's going to be for you guys to figure it out. Between June 5th and June 7th, Israel had crossed multiple states and was now in New York. He'd spent his time fishing and camping with the supplies that he now had. Israel found that his Constable property grounds were very overgrown. As a result of this, he only managed to plant 6 trees on this trip. By this point, Israel was likely very eager to find a victim. He had already driven far and had spent some days and nights in the outdoors. Israel had a hotel reservation in Essex, Vermont, and would arrive at Handy Suites on June 7th. He checked into room 216 and decided that the immediate area would be his hunting zone. Vermont would be the location for his next major crime. He wanted to go all out. The reason for why he picked Vermont was never explained. Israel had a stash of guns buried along the Winooski River from his 2009 trip and wanted to dig them up and check on their condition. He didn't want to have to experience another issue with one of his caches, caused by a river flooding. Israel found an abandoned house along Route 15. He considered it as a place to take a victim. It could be useful. He'd also been looking for churches, but nothing sufficed when it came to that plan. Israel had a 3-day fishing licence on this trip, and he was sighted at a community garden in Essex around this time. He offered to help a couple plant some trees, but they wisely refused his advances. As Israel's in the local area, it makes sense that he was looking for potential victims, and it doesn't seem like a stretch to suggest that he probably picked out the Courier home during the daytime. He might have seen Bill or Lorraine outside, tending to their garden. They were house proud after all and loved the garden. Israel might have sparked up conversation, but whatever transpired before the night of June 8th will forever remain a mystery. In the early evening hours of June 8th, Israel sat in his hotel room. He had dug up his cache by the Winooski River and had the guns in his room. He put together his prized silencer and had his rucksack with him. As mentioned earlier, Israel wanted to go all out on this trip, abduct a victim, take their life, and then use their car for multiple bank robberies just north of Essex in the morning. Following the robberies, he'd torched the victim's car near to the spot where he had dug up his cache. Israel had always mentioned having many plans. His adaptability enabled him to go through with some of the ideas and cancel any which were too risky or wild. There have been many examples of scenarios like this. The May Anchorage parking lot stakeouts stand out as examples. If a situation was far too risky or didn't work out, he could avert it and do something else. Israel walked around town after dark. By this point his cell phone was turned off and the battery had long since been removed. He was looking for a man to carjack. The rain disrupted his plan as an intended victim rushed from his car seat to his apartment. Fortunately, Israel didn't have time to intervene. Unfortunately, Israel wasn't all bothered by this. He returned to his hotel room and waited till even later on in the evening. He was going to now look for a house with a couple in it. Why Israel drastically changed his victim profile is very unclear. He'd been seeking a young couple in May, but that hadn't worked out. I assume that he was fixated on the idea of having a couple under his full control, no matter their ages. Much like with Samantha Koenig, nothing would stop him from fulfilling his fantasies. Israel headed back behind his hotel and walked through neighbourhoods. He came across the Courier house and broke into the attached garage. If you've listened to the interrogation tapes on my channel, then you know what happens next. Israel waited until 1 or 2 AM and then did a blitz attack on Bill and Lorraine. He looted their valuables, restrained and questioned them, likely to overwhelm and throw them off guard, making them think that his ransom ruse was true and that he had indeed come to kidnap them for ransom. Israel transported Bill and Lorraine back to his vehicle, chucked some drain cleaner bags and a shovel into their trunk and then took them to the farmhouse. You all know what happened at the farmhouse and I won't cover what came to light in the interrogation room. I'll now move on to what went down after the Courier murders. Israel, now in his heightened state following a double murder, began driving up to the banks. However, car trouble had him concerned for his own safety. He was at greater risk of apprehension if his escape vehicle conked out right after multiple bank takeovers. The bank plans didn't work out and so Israel claimed to have just driven back to his vehicle and left Vermont to travel up to Maine. What he left out was revealed by the True Crime BS podcast. A user posted a sale advert for a vehicle which bore many similarities to the Courier vehicle. The user, who was named Israel, had posted the advert on Craigslist and was eager to meet up with a female who was interested in the car. The meet-up destination was a parking lot just northeast of Essex, Vermont in a different town. The female arrived at the destination but Israel never showed. Someone was circling the parking lot in a car which matched this sale listing. If this was Israel, then he was likely seeking a new victim to replace his bank robberies. He was still locked into his adrenaline high after all. It would appear like Israel didn't abduct anyone else other than the Couriers on this trip though, but this possibility leaves many doors open. Israel would end up in Maine, completely worn out by his movements and activities. He spent some days with his brothers before heading back down to Vermont. Before entering Vermont, he stopped at a national park in New Hampshire. Israel considered shooting a just married couple, but it was way too risky as a nearby park ranger prevented any further murders. He headed back to Vermont and drove past the Courier vehicle, now a fresh crime scene. Law enforcement were on edge and concerned about the suspicious nature of the Courier disappearance. Everyone in Essex was shaken up over the possibility of foul play and Israel scrapped any further plan involving their vehicle, deciding to head back to New York. On arriving at the ferry to cross over Lake Champlain, he picked up a newspaper and read about the sudden disappearance of Bill and Lorraine, probably feeling a sense of achievement and glee from the story. Israel got back to New York and disposed of the barrel of the gun used to kill Bill Currier in a reservoir. He later returned to Indiana. He met back up with his mother and sisters and talked about having been to his property, along with spending some time in Vermont. Israel walked with his sisters through the woods. and broke down in tears during one of their conversations, likely a result of his actions on the trip and the inner conflict that he seemed to experience and express every now and then. He'd been pulled toward evil after all. Israel then drove back the way he came and flew out of Chicago on June the 15th. Another series of unsolved events remained dormant for a while, and it was only when Israel figured that he may as well give investigators 2 bodies because their names were on his computer that he confessed just under a year later. This has been the timeline of events for the Courier trip. As always, thank you for watching.